Joining us now is a good friend of the program. Kathleen Frydl is a historian. She's the author of two books, right? Two books, The GI Bill and The Drug Wars in America, 1940 to 1973. She is also a frequent commentator on current events, and we wanted to talk to her now about a recent piece she did in the Huffington Post entitled The Real Story of American Exceptionalism. So, Kathleen, thanks for joining us again.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, Richard.
Good to have you. So, first of all, you wrote this piece a couple days ago, based a little more, about a week ago, based on a quote that Hillary Clinton used. Hillary Clinton said, defending American exceptionalism should always be above politics. This seems to be a constant theme in the American political dialogue right now, that Democrats are repeating the frame about political American exceptionalism, while simultaneously Republicans both repeat it and accuse Democrats of not repeating it. Is that a fair kind of, it's this trope that people argue over who can embrace more?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I first want to start out by saying that that particular quote, which was nested within a larger speech by Hillary Clinton on American exceptionalism, is itself a political move, right? We can't view placing something out of the reach of politics, supposedly out of the reach of politics, as anything other than political in and of itself. So, excuse me, it's not like it's a neutral or apolitical concept. And so what I did in this piece was just run through the various ways in which American exceptionalism has been deployed and used. And what we find, and it's very much as you say, is that there's no way for progressives or Democrats to embrace the framing of American exceptionalism without also embracing and legitimizing its key ideas. And several of those ideas are not just delimiting, they're not just kind of exclusive of progressive goals, they actually are inimical to them. So it's even more bizarre than one would think. You're not just repeating something that someone else is, accusing you of. You're actually, in repeating it, undermining some of your own cherished goals.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because Barack Obama has done this many times also. At least that's my sense. He's also, so let's talk. And in fact, I think I doubt I can think of a Democratic president who hasn't. And so I guess I would say. But you're the historian. But
I know, I'm thinking.
I know, I can see. But I would characterize the notion of American exceptionalism as meaning our country has unique qualities as a beacon of freedom, as an example for the rest of the world to follow, that we have unique value, unique qualities that no other country has, that both entitle us to certain things and impose upon us as a nation in the international sphere certain responsibilities that we must carry out. That's am I close to what you think a definition?
You're not just close, but you're exactly on point of what progressives have struggled to try to get American exceptionalism to mean. Like, they've tried to corral it into that corner, which is a corner that says basically America is distinct and it has a distinctive past and a distinct role in the world. What we find American exceptionalism actually means is, in practice and in the hands of Republicans, is that America is not simply distinct, it's superior. Mm-hmm. And cannot, its motives are unimpeachable and cannot be questioned and shouldn't be subject to accountability. So what we actually see American exceptionalism as an operative concept do is carve out an exception for the United States to the very principles you and other progressives try to get American exceptionalism to mean. So I found it very interesting in this particular speech, just as an example.
Hillary Clinton's
when Hillary Clinton,
When
Hillary Clinton spoke to the American Legion, she discussed cyber warfare. And in her discussion of it, she said very loosely, Russia's been hacking like crazy. China's been hacking like crazy. And then she said it's time for the United States to respond. And what she omitted in her, brief litany of those people who have been hacking like crazy is the United States. In fact, the United States has been hacking like crazy. One of the most proactive and really stunning cases of cyber warfare, something can be called cyber warfare, is the Stuxnet virus,
Stuxnet, yeah.
right, that attacked the Iranian nuclear facility. Now, people can say that was great, it was not great, but it was a proactive move of cyber warfare. The United States has been out there hacking like crazy in ways that we know about and ways that we don't. But what we see the language of American exceptionalism do time and again is sort of erase American power from the world. And it's, American exceptionalism, I think, is used to assert a sort of a priori innocence on the part of American power. And American power is never implicated in the problems of the world. And likewise, Americans should never be subjected to the international rules, principles like Geneva Convention, so on and so forth. See, this is the actual work that we see American exceptionalism doing in the world. And the question before us is whether it's possible to take what it's doing and kind of clean it, scour it of all of its current meanings and impute a new set of meanings to it. And I would argue no, right? I mean, it's funny that you brought up Obama, because as I was coming here, I was thinking about, do you remember the American flag lapel pin?
Oh, absolutely, of course.
Issue with Obama,
Sure.
where he's not wearing one, he's not wearing one, he's not wearing one. And he started out by saying, it's totally fine that I'm not wearing one, actually. It doesn't make me any less of a patriot. And then, sure enough, the criticism got to such a level that he put one on, right? So it's the same thing with American exceptionalism. Like, you're never able to carve out these finer points of distinction, right, within the theory of American exceptionalism until you put the lapel pin on and say, I accept the kind of, USA chance, this argument of superiority, not just distinction, but superiority. And in particular, American exceptionalism has been used to argue that the United States should enjoy not just military supremacy, not just unchallenged military supremacy, but the military itself should be unaccountable to the American people.
Right. And, it's interesting, because I'm glad you brought up the flag pin lapel, because, and again, we're talking with historian Kathleen Frydl about American exceptionalism, because I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a kind of rhetorical feint in that direction that a politician has to do, where they just say, we live in the greatest country on earth.
Right.
You can't get elected, presumably, if you don't say that. If you say, well, I know 3 or 4 other countries I like better, you probably don't win. But then there is the assumption of privilege or power that you were describing earlier. What struck me when you were talking about Hillary Clinton's speech, where she said, because we are exceptional, we should do what all the other countries are doing. There's an inherent contradiction in that. In other words, they're doing cyber warfare, leaving aside your point, which is that they are that we are already conducting cyber warfare. You also have the issue that I find it often that the American exceptionalism argument is used in order to justify doing what everybody else does.
Right, like joining the pack.
Right.
Right.
How does that work?
It works because American power, since really it became a global superpower, American power has been legitimized by depicting itself as reactive, reluctant, and restrained, right? So there's something innocent about the way we're going about it. The problem with that is, as often as that's true, it's not true, right? And this cyber warfare thing would be an example of, one case in which the United States has already been up to a lot of stuff that we know about and that we don't know about, right? So now we're joining the pack, but we're doing it only reluctantly, right? And only in reaction. We've been dragged into this dirty world.
In other words, in this case, the American exceptionalism is we have higher values than that. We are more ethical than that. Regrettably, we find ourselves, despite our superior moral status, forced to behave like you hooligans out there. So, right?
And very few of us would question the right to self-defense, right? And so that's the larger principle at work here. The problem is it's not purely or simply a defensive posture. American power has been exerted in this world in ways, again, that we know about and in ways that we don't. And those exertions of power, those very broad exercises and the kind of discretion we've given to our political establishment bears real consequences. It matters that we supported Saddam Hussein in the 1980s to the extent that we did. That's a story that's not limited just to the 1980s. It bears fruit decades and decades after that, right? American power has
or
been...
that we supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who later turned out to be the groundings of...
And then we abandoned them.
Right,
We supported and abandoned them, so that's very typical as well. And so American power is implicated in many of the things that we think we're above.
Right.
Right?
Right, of course. So let's get back then to this issue of progressives and Democrats and the notion of American exceptionalism. Sometimes I get the sense that it's kind of a Rorschach test, the phrase American exceptionalism, that when a certain type of authoritarian conservative uses the phrase, he or she means our ability to impose our will on others, because we have an exceptional viewpoint or ground on which to do so. And for a progressive, well, because we are finer people who are interested in the justice and equality of all human beings, we are in an exceptional position to do that for others, and therefore we must. But that position, the progressive projection, makes them particularly susceptible to manipulation. Here's what I mean, and then tell me what you think. For example, when the Bush administration wanted to intervene in Iraq, the way to get Democrats to go along and liberals to go along was to say, women in Iraq are oppressed, and we will help them.
Right.
Women in the Middle East are oppressed, and we will help them, with no interest in the oppression of women here or in other parts of the world. So that the selective administration of or dispensing of liberal values under the guise of American exceptionalism is used to manipulate people into things we would really not want to support as progressives.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the piece, or towards the end of the piece, one of the things I say is, at bottom, American exceptionalism is not just an assertion of a certain kind of narrative, it's an assertion of the right to determine the narrative, right? And there's a great Dorothy Parker quote, which I use in this piece, about the acting range of Audrey Hepburn, which is something like, she examines the entire gamut of human emotions from A to B.
Right.
You know? And I think American exceptionalism allows for many different shadings between A and B, like you're talking about. And women aren't particularly treated well in Iraq, or perhaps weren't at the time, right? Between A and B, there are finer shadings. The question is, there's an alphabet after that. You know what I mean? There's a larger story and narrative, not just to tell, but to be held accountable to, right? So I think progressives have got to regard the language of American exceptionalism, and again, just to return to this point, in particular, the work that it does exonerating the military or sequestering the military from other questions of American politics. I just want to bring up very quickly that one of the things Hillary Clinton said in this speech is that the military should be exempted from the process of budget sequestration. Progressives in general, perhaps you, definitely me, don't like the budget sequestration, period. Right? But the question of whether the military in and of itself deserves to be exempt from it, especially at a time when the United States military enjoys a budget that is 7 times larger than all the countries behind it, the next countries behind it, all 7 of them combined. I mean, we are spending way more on our military than any other nation on earth.
And there's an enormous amount of waste in that spending. There's an enormous amount of extravagance, even when it's not defined as waste. And there's an enormous amount of overlap where there's both. I mean, just to close the loop on Iraq, I think women were actually much better off, ironically, under the Saddam dictatorship than they are now, with the repression that's taken place now. The other piece of American exceptionalism is we never come back and check and hold ourselves accountable for, well, did we really help those women? So I guess to wrap up, how should progressives look at this issue of American exceptionalism? Are we really... Is it something we should just stay away from? Should we just say we're part of the community of nations and we owe it to ourselves to behave as such and get rid of this notion of exceptionalism altogether?
I mean, I'm coming from a point of view where I am saying that. I'm saying that it does not mean anything to put on a lapel pin if it's compulsory. It does not mean anything to stand for our national anthem if not standing. When so much disapproval, you have to call it compulsory, right? I mean, we cannot be these things cannot be genuine, patriotic, voluntary sentiments if we actually have no choice in whether or not we want to do them. In invoking American exceptionalism, we're giving legitimacy to a whole set of issues, ideas, and people that are menacing for progressive ideals and values, and menacing to the very things that do make this country distinctive and have for a very long time.
Well said, and I have nothing to add to that except that as for the Pledge of Allegiance, and as far as that's concerned, people think that's been around forever. It's only been around
1950s.
1950s, yeah, I think Eisenhower administration. So again, we're exceptional in our ability to forget as well. But historian Kathleen Frydl, as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.